On the Gulf Coast, we're at the center of feeling the impacts of climate change. Strong hurricanes have pummeled the Southeast this year, and we've had record high temperatures throughout October. Across the world, the impacts of climate change are being felt, but in some parts they are undoubtedly stronger and faster in coming. These places serve as kinds of bellwethers for what's coming everywhere. But an accompanying reality with this feeling is that our homes are changing. The places we live in are becoming foreign to us in a way. This feeling of loss is related to climate anxiety or grief, but it goes by another name, solastalgia. And it's the subject of a new art exhibit at San Jacinto College, alongside a new immersive theater piece happening over the next 2 weeks there. I'm Weston Twardowski, an instructor in and associate director of Rice University's Center for Environmental Studies and associate director of Eco Studio in Rice's Sustainability Institute. And you're listening to Gulf Streams on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM, where we talk with leading experts and community leaders to better understand the environmental problems and potential solutions facing our community. A quick reminder that you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. We're sitting down today with Bradley Brown, Jonelle Walker, and Sarah Welch, who are the brain trust behind these upcoming projects at San Jacinto College. So would you just start us off, Jonelle, maybe introducing yourself and a little bit of how this collaboration came to be?
Sure, happy to. I'm Jonelle Walker. I'm the program coordinator for theater and film at San Jacinto College's South Campus. The start of this project was really that I became a fan of Sarah's work. I saw an installation of hers at the Galveston Arts Center, and I kind of walked into a room where she had these backdrops hung on the walls, and there were white coolers with green seats on them, and I just thought, this is a person who needs to be making theater. It really just, that was the instant thought. So I texted Bradley and I said, hey, do you know this local artist named Sarah Welch? I think she would be the perfect fit for an idea we had had for a while since I'd gotten my job at San Jacinto South to have a kind of theatrical haunted house. And I thought, yeah, Sarah's the right fit. The sort of magical connections didn't stop there, though. I mean, once we started talking to Sarah about this project, one of the things that we started to realize as we were developing alongside Bradley's art gallery show was that the Brio Superfund site, being across from our campus, was sort of this story that was reaching out to us to be told. And because we had this opportunity to work with Sarah and her, interest in the Gulf land and the geography and the plant life and the animal life, it felt like the perfect marriage.
All right, that's exciting. We're going to come back to the Brio site itself and talk more about the history of that. But Bradley, maybe you can tell us a little about the exhibit that you're putting together and running now, actually.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks so much for also having us here. It's really great to be able to talk about this collaboration.
Can you get that closer to you? Sorry.
Yeah. It's really great to be able to get to talk about this collaboration because we've been working on it for so long and it's taken so many different tangents and it's really come together. So thank you. The current exhibition, the title is Solastalgia, and it started initially with a local artist, Kathy Kaiser, who I'd worked with in the past. She's a printmaker who works with a local print shop called Burning Bones. And we had done a collaboration about a year and a half ago with Burning Bones and done a big exhibition of their members. And then Kathy came to me with an idea to have curate a 5-artist show of 5 local Houston artists. We have Renata Lucia, Kathy Kaiser, Ellen Ray, Cindy Clement, and Heather L. Johnson. And they all came together not totally sure how this exhibition was going to evolve. And that initiated a longer conversation into what Jonelle and I had been talking about with this idea to do more of a compartmentalized haunted house based on eco-anxiety. So students would be able to walk around, experience this haunted house around this time of year. But instead of wolverines and vampires, it was going to be flooding and heat.
Arguably much scarier.
I think so as well, and I think the students and the community would respond to it in a way like very unexpected, novel approach to it. So our exhibition has evolved, and we just opened last week. It's been very well attended, I think. We've had about a dozen class visits. Since our primary focus is kind of bringing this stuff to the students. And really excited for this whole collaborative experience. And it's going to kind of come to a head in about a week when the theater kind of goes live, and then we can open up the gallery. And there's a lot more that I'm sure we'll talk about, where we have been able to collaborate with local community leaders like Marie Flickinger, who's on the board of directors, who is really kind of the really push forward with a lot of the stuff with the Brio and how big of a deal that played in the exhibition and obviously the play.
Great. And Sarah, you are a truly multidisciplinary artist. It seems like your work's jumping form and structure constantly. Do you want to talk a little about your practice?
Sure. Yeah. Firstly, that's not on purpose at all. Actually, I would advise all artists not to do that, but it's terrible for your career. But yeah, I'm a Houston artist, illustrator, comics maker. I'm one of the co-organizers with Zine Fest Houston. And yeah, first time playwright, I guess, now. Yeah.
So tell us, so I had heard about this through a colleague and was excited to see both a piece of immersive theater thinking deeply about Brio. Especially, we actually had Heather L. Johnson on the program a couple of weeks ago talking about the Brio site. But maybe first just walk us back and remind us, what is the Brio Superfund site that you mentioned is right across from your campus?
We were just talking about, like, okay, how are we going to address Brio? But
I mean, we'll dive in. That's how we'll address it, and we'll name the Superfund site and talk a little about it.
I think through this whole thing, especially opening up the gallery exhibition, one of the most interesting things to me has been how little people know about it anymore. Especially at San Jac South, we are literally directly across the street from this Superfund site. And I think the first thing that I tend to address when talking to students in the community is just, do you know what a Superfund site is? Because even that word, that idea is kind of foreign to most people. So we're talking about sites, pieces of land that have been declared kind of off limits for any type of development. They need to be rehabilitated. The Brio Superfund site goes back to the 70s and 80s with the petrochemical plant that was on Dixie Farm Road and Beamer, that area, that was illegally burying their runoff, their toxic waste from the petrochemical plant in that neighborhood. This was before the development had happened for the neighborhood, and then literally almost 700 houses were built on top of this site. Over the years, there was a spike in cancer rates, birth defects, other health responses happening in that neighborhood to the people living there. And, that kind of started the dominoes falling to find out what had happened. Eventually, the entire neighborhood had to be shut down, and those families relocated. I'm not sure how to put that, but basically had to start new lives elsewhere and then deal with the health repercussions of the illegal burying of this waste product.
I think if I could add anything to that, it would be that one of the parts of this story that I think is so compelling in local history is that obviously the Houston greater metropolitan area is fueled literally by the energy corridor and the petrochemical industry. So it's very interesting that, like Bradley said, though this Dixie Oil Company was right there next to where our campus is, and this Superfund site, as a result of their illegal dumping, is so close to our campus, so many of our students and community members aren't aware that it's there, and its relationship to that that industry, even though one of our very board of directors or board of trustees chair was an advocate, Marie Flickinger, drawing attention to this issue. I think one of the bits of this history that we're interested in, not just the sort of health fallout and the chemicals in the ground, which are obviously very germane to what we're talking about on this podcast, but also the people in the heart of this story, like Marie, who were shouting out to anyone that could hear them, hey, we know something's wrong here. Our children are sick. There is tar coming up from the ground. This is not right. And it took years for them to be heard in that story. And Marie, we spoke to her not too long ago, and one of the things she told me that was so compelling was that she, at one point, questioned whether it was even worth it to keep fighting to have Brio addressed by the EPA, because it was just such a hard and long-fought process that involved an incredible amount of testing, an incredible amount of evaluation, medical tests that putting all these families through what had already been an incredible amount of suffering. But she said there was some force inside her that said, no, this is important, even though people might hate you. You got to keep pushing because in the end, you're going to save a lot of people. And I think that part of the history is also really compelling, obviously, that we are harming our land in all of these ways, but also that we as a community can stand up and say exactly what Marie said, which is something is not right here.
I think that's interesting for two reasons. One, you mentioned the history of the site, which certainly is hyper-relevant, but the site's also not gone away.
Yeah, it's here.
It's not a relic.
You can see it.
Yeah. And so, it's very much, I think, I would imagine anything you're doing is in conversation, certainly with that history, but also with the living site today and the kind of ongoing legacy of this environmental issue. The other aspect that I think is hyper relevant to the Houston area is, we have 24 Superfund sites in the area with a ready list of potential additional ones we could add on that, depending on who you talk to, is in the hundreds, if not thousands, of potential sites. And these long, prolonged battles that local communities have to engage in to protect their health, to protect where they live, is certainly something that runs the gamut across the region and is something that we see played out. We see it playing out right now in areas like the Fifth Ward that are dealing with creosote fallout, and something we've talked about in the program in previous episodes. So I think as a part of Houston's environmental story, both history, yes, but also living present, Brio is, to your point, is not perhaps the most readily known of the kind of environmental avenues that we most explore, but it's certainly one of the most prominent historically and in terms of advocacy over the last 50 years. So I'm curious to pivot slightly to the art product here, which is, I believe the gallery exhibit is Solastalgia, and the theatrical piece is The Pits. And so tell me a little about how these two things go together and maybe the impetus of Solastalgia, which I don't know that you've really defined for us and gone into yet.
So Solastalgia, first, I kind of introduced the exhibition with the title because it's maybe a word that people aren't familiar with. I wasn't familiar with it at all until...
it's a more recent concept in the dark corners of environmental humanities land. So it's a more recent one coming out, yeah.
It's really interesting to kind of introduce that to the students and get their initial ideas of what it means and what we're talking about. When we started the show, the curator of the exhibition, one of the two curators, Kathy Kaiser, who wanted to title the show Solastalgia, kind of brought that into my vernacular. I was unfamiliar with it through research. I've read a lot about these ideas and how the phrase is entered into our ecological vernacular. The best definition I've kind of heard it described is this feeling of being homesick, even though you've never left your home. This idea that you're in the middle of an environment, an area that is changing and it's kind of out of your control and you just have to deal with the fallout from it. And I think talking to students, that idea seems to be what they respond to the most. Plus, the exhibition isn't necessarily based around Brio. specifically. That's just one element that the show is talking about, where a lot of the other artists in the exhibition are all talking about things like environmental change and the natural world we live in. Not all of it is about pollution, but I think they're all addressing this idea of how kind of mind-blowing the natural world is and how we can play a role in it. I know a lot of the artists also collaborated with our science department to use some of their tools, microscopes, telescopes, to do some research that directly led into the artwork they were making, drawings and paintings, even video pieces as well. So they were really excited to come to San Jac and use our facilities in a way that helped them kind of develop their creative voice. And then pivoting back to Brio, San Jac South Library does have the archive of the Brio case. A lot of the legal battles. We do have a place in our library that has archived all that work, and that archive was opened up to the artists to go use that information in their work a little bit. So while not all of the artists are focused on Brio, and the show isn't about that, it is definitely about how we interact in the natural world around us, for good things, for bad things. It's more of an investigation of that relationship.
No, certainly. I mean, changing environments are not limited to Superfund sites, but when one does have one across the street from you, it's hard not for it to enter the work in some way. So to that, I want to hear more about the pits too. So tell me a little about, I mean, you mentioned this kind of eco-haunted house, it sounds like, but yeah, how did this collaboration beyond enjoying Sarah's work get started? And then, what can we expect from the pits as it gets ready to open?
Well, I guess I can start a little bit about pre-Sarah, and then I'll pitch it over to Sarah for the development of the script and the project itself. But Bradley and I, when I first got my job at San Jacinto South, one of the first things I was told was that the theater department had always wanted to do a haunted house. And I thought, yeah, that's a great idea. But me being the artist I am, I was like, yeah, let's do something really scary like climate change, which seems like a sort of glib joke. But as we were talking about before, I think there's a genuine terror in that is challenging to capture, but is also very important and very visceral in ways that I respond to as an artist. So starting from that idea, I mean, when we met with Sarah first to talk about the project after I had sort of just encountered her work and really enjoyed it, we went to her studio at the University of Houston. And we were talking about what could this story be about? What could this haunted house walkthrough be? And then we just started talking about Brio and Marie's experience advocating for the people who lived there. And I think there was something in that conversation really about how we're going to be doing this immersive work in a building that is named after Marie Flickinger across the street from the Brio Superfund site. And nothing could be more present than really telling the stories of the people who lived there in the past, present, and future. So I think with that, I'll let Sarah pick it up where it went from there.
I think when Jonelle and Bradley first approached me about this project, there was talk about adapting a comic series that I have, an ongoing comic series called Holdouts, which is sort of a speculative fiction about the Gulf Coast and like what the Gulf might look like in 50, 60 years. And when they told me the story about the Brio site as like another route which we might take to play, I was really drawn to that because I had never heard of it. But my family is from Texas City and lived in very close proximity to a lot of the refineries there. And so like that hit home immediately. Thinking about, the like ever-present sense of like danger to live in close proximity to something like that.
Well, and growing up in Texas City, the site of the worst industrial disaster in U.S. history, but I can understand why that might be present of mind.
Yes, yeah. Some of my mom's early memories about living there are about watching plant explosions happen from their back porch and about the fear of trying to evacuate, because at that time in the 70s. I don't know if this is still the case with the roads, but she described it as there's only one way in and one way out of Texas City. And so evacuating is always a bit of a traffic jam and, a really scary situation. So that's always stuck with me. And that idea of sort of like that like generational like fear and anxiety, I think is something I tried to imbue with the characters in the play. And in the play, we're seeing like multiple generations from the original family who buys a house in the South Bend neighborhood that was built in really close proximity to the Brio refinery, and then their children, and then all the way up into the I think it's like the year 2065, and it's the great grandchildren of this like original family. So yeah, we get to see that like ripple effect happening.
Yeah, and I have to say, working on the play, especially as the director, being so close to the development of the characters, one of the things that I connected to, too, as a native Houstonian, was this idea that when your home becomes this place that people either factually or just sort of spiritually and socially decide is like worthless or like a dumping zone, or I think as you call it, a sacrifice zone in some of your work, it changes not only how you feel about your environment and maybe you get physically displaced, but also something that's present in the characters in the pits, I think, is the way that it changes your relationships to your family, that kind of the way that anxiety and generational trauma, really works on you and your connections and the way you think about family and home. Yeah, that's something that in the play really, really sticks with me.
No, I mean, I think what you're hitting on there is that kind of nexus point of climate change, environmental loss, solastalgia, these kind of feelings around that loss of home, but tied very much to the environmental justice perspective, which is exactly the sacrifice zone, that kind of state authority that has regulated particular areas. Particularly here, we see the Golden Triangle exactly going out to areas around the region where these are just areas we have decided are not where we're going to invest, right? Not where we're going to make life easy or sustainable. But those two things conflate, and like this is a classic kind of conversation in environmental justice circles, are those overlaps that in between of the communities that are already in places we have decided are not where we're going to work to sustain life are the ones most vulnerable to all of the various things around climate change, which is how we can easily pivot from something like the Brio site over to flooding and heat and recognize that these are interrelated, interconnected threats. I'm curious about, so the Pits is meant to be an immersive piece, yes. I mean, you've mentioned Haunted House, which is, I think theater scholars would point us to like a kind of prototypical form of immersive theater.
Indeed.
There's a whole body of literature I'm sure we could get very nerdy about, but
Different podcast.
Yeah, different show. We can grab Harvey Young and get on his podcast for that. But yeah, I'm curious about the idea of this haunted house. Of in particular, what does an immersive experience give us, especially living somewhere where, in many ways, we already feel immersed in our daily life in these ideas. So, what does walking through a room give the audience and maybe your actors and the folks working on it, that there's something different than going and kind of sitting down and watching a 2-hour piece of theater about something?
It's so interesting. I was talking about this exact topic with my fiance last night because I keep sending him pictures of the set, and he keeps going, "Is that inside or outside?" And I keep telling him that's the uncanny effect that I'm going for. So perfect. Because I think that there's something, and this is where we're going to get very nerdy in the theatrical stuff, is that there is a quality of uncanniness in immersion, especially very detailed, realistic immersion, which is what in many ways we're going for with the Pits, where you have just enough distance to find it suddenly unsettling and strange. And I think that cognitive dissonance that audiences are going to feel in a manufactured set of a site that is 1,000 feet away will give them, I hope, some distance to have Marie's response to Brio, right? Something's not right here. This is not normal. There's something unsettled in the air. So I think that that's what I'm hoping the immersion is going to do, not just sort of, like you said, the traditional philosophy behind immersion about really bringing you closer to the ideas and really putting you inside of an experience that may not be your own. But in this case, it's actually saying, hey, here is your experience, but reproduced uncannily. How does it look when you see it just slightly altered?
So, okay, without trying to go too deep in the weeds on theater nerddom, I mean, some of what you're getting at is a kind of distancing, right?
Yeah.
Is a kind of estrangement or defamiliarization, which many art forms, are attuned to. But I think in particular here, what's really interesting and exciting about this work is really, I don't think we often have theatrical experiences, and sometimes even we could argue artistic experiences that are focused on what happens when you make your backyard strange. That feels really thoughtful to me in a way that we become immunized in a certain way to the environment around us, to the environmental factors around us. We become aware that hurricane season means hurricanes are coming. And while we can certainly be shocked out of that periodically by one that has profound impact, I mean, part of the condition of being a Gulf Southerner is a certain awareness and familiarity with things like flooding and hurricanes. I think I would argue that for the last few years, the extreme effects of those things and the higher numbers of them have shifted some of our thinking around this, and what feels normal feels to be in flux to most of the people I talk to. But it's still something that feels conditional to who we are, to where we live, to the experience we're used to. And so what I find so fascinating here is that's something we also see within environmental justice communities, is certain folks like Marie, who you've mentioned, who are advocating and out saying daily, this is not tolerable, this is not acceptable and the norm, this is something we have to resist. But it can also become very easy to be conditioned to the world around us to say, well, this is the way it is. This is what we expect and what we take. And so the fact that you are doing work to say you are familiar with this area, you know campus, you know the area around campus and where you grew up and lived, what happens if we in some way take you through that in a way that makes that unstable for you and perhaps allows you to imagine or ask the question of why is it the way it is, and also then imagine, are there other ways of being that aren't where we are right now? I think is something that seems to run through a variety of strands of environmental art, including your own, Sarah. I mean, your broader practice, you were mentioning thinking about these kind of Gulf coastal futures, and I would love to know more about how you are imagining that kind of what is the Gulf Coast in these hypothetical futures.
Sure. So in the Holdouts comics, one of the defining features of that story is the idea that coastal areas, especially the Gulf Coast, have been more or less like de-assessed by the state, by the federal government, and are just sort of a no man's land that nobody wants to claim, that there's no government oversight, because in the same way that now insurance companies are leaving, it's too costly, and it's too it's just not worth the risk level to be like responsible for those areas. So in those comics, each chapter of the comic follows a different protagonist, and we're basically seeing how they navigate this environment, like, and a little bit about why they would choose to stay instead of migrating elsewhere. Whether that's like they have no choice, maybe they just feel very like emotionally tied to the place, different reasons for each character. And I feel like I still had that mindset in my mind while we were working on this project too, because again, there's some speculation, sort of like trying to think about what the future might hold for this region.
I mean, that seems to echo a kind of broader strain of science fiction, what we might call climate fiction, cli-fi thinking. Jeff Vandermeer, prominent author, who's probably best known for Annihilation, which was turned into a film a few years back, has written a number of these kind of speculative futures that also enmesh the Gulf Coast in this kind of what happens when the sacrifice zone becomes truly disconnected from the state, and becomes a kind of nowhere space. And so I think that's certainly what you're talking about resonates with larger strains of kind of how artists, writers, thinkers are imagining Gulf Coast futures and a certain apocalyptic sense. I think there are some artists who also have more hopeful imaginings for what we might be going towards. Yeah.
Yeah. That the idea of hope is definitely something we discuss with this project too, because in those like early comics, I definitely reached a point where I was like having to decide for myself, like, oh, do I want to like insert an idea of hope here, and like what does that look like? And that's something we talked about with this project, especially in terms of I think with a lot of like apocalyptic fiction stuff, there's this very American idea of like the individual and like how important your like individual agency is, and like like survival. And really I think I'd like to push back against that a little bit and say really it's more important to have like communal agency. Because I don't think individual agency has really been effective thus far.
I mean, it's also something. It's one of the kind of funny things I often tell students in class is, the kind of fallacy notion of I can go off on the land and survive by myself, and like, well, that's just not real. I'm sorry, survivalists listening along. Your fantasy is inaccurate because you will run out of bolts for your crossbow and have to go into town and buy more. Like, the reality is you can survive for some set of time on your own in wherever, but there is an end date to how long we as humans are okay on our own. We have to have other people working in some form of even very small community just to share the work that's required for life. And there's really not a way around that. Jonelle, you looked like you wanted to jump in.
Oh, just that I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think it's one of the beautiful things that brings this marriage between Sarah's work and theater together so well is that the idea of community agency is so supported by the form of theater, right? I mean, if you bring a group of people together in a room and give them the hope of coming together to, if not, I don't think we're suggesting with the play that one day we're all going to clean up the Brio site and this is going to be a perfect place where everyone will thrive and live because, as we were reminded of in our research for this piece, that's just not realistic. That's not what the site's going to be. However, can we come together as a community to steward it and let it sort of thrive in its own way and exist alongside us? Yes, we can do that. And so it's really nice to just have those moments of connection, right? That community is how we thrive, community is how we survive, and theater helps us do that.
I think it might be kind of an obvious segue, but I just keep thinking about one of the times we met with Marie, and I mean, we're putting this production on and this exhibition on at a community college, and Marie has been so supportive of this community and of this college for so long now, and we're having a conversation with her, and she turns to us and says, like, what do you think of the term community college? Do you think that's accurate? Do you think that's correct? And I was kind of hesitated, and she like reiterated, she's like, tell me what you think about community college. And just coming from my background in the arts and working a lot, doing a lot of collaborative projects. I really like collaboration. And then working on this project with Sarah and Jonelle and the whole theater crew and the whole gallery crew and everyone, and seeing the students there, like, I'm very much in support of this idea of community. So it's really exciting to hear having this conversation and putting an emphasis on how important that community is and coming together of people to kind of support not only these creative projects that we're working on, which sometimes get swept under the rug a little bit, but also as a way for us to kind of reinforce this history where we are as a neighborhood, as a community, as a city, and put that in a spotlight to give hope, I think, because things come out of that community building. And if we can help promote that, I think that's what these shows are really trying to do, is bring people together, create a conversation. That's what art should be about in all forms, is to create these conversations so they don't fade away. And I think that's one of the purposes with the Brio concentration.
I'm really, I mean, I will say, I think our artistic sensibilities line up in that prioritization of hope and engagement. I'm curious if you can tell us a little bit about what you've learned over the process of putting together the exhibit, of putting together the show, of things that maybe that your students have learned too, but I'd love to know about the process on your end as well. I think it's one of the things that we don't often acknowledge, but the kind of transformational experience that artists go through in the process of making art, especially art that is centered on real living issues and real places. And I would love to hear some about what that's been like and things you've walked away from this with.
From my perspective, and then I'll pass it off, working in the gallery and just with a lot of visual art, working with the visual artists. And I've been working in museums and galleries for a long time as an artist, as a curator, as an art handler. And it always is funny to me, this idea that I keep revisiting and I'm surprised with every time. But for a quick example of it, we're looking at an artwork being installed in the show, talking about how it's successfully working or maybe not successfully working. And I had an issue with an area that I thought maybe needed to be kind of cleaned up and refined. It was showing some parts that I thought weren't helping the piece, but they were distracting from the piece. And how we're going to address, if you're seeing something that isn't adding to the artwork, then you need to get rid of it. All those elements need to work together. And I was talking to the artist about this, and she's like, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't see what you're talking about. And I was like, it's right there. And she had to get up on her tippy toes and look over. She's like, oh, you can see it because you're taller than me. I can't see that from where I'm at. And I think we both had this realization that our interaction with these artworks is so much dependent on our own personal perspective and our own personal place in the world, even if it's just the physical world. And I think taking that over into something like the theater show, something like a bigger conversation about environmentalism and environmental awareness and disasters, they're so personalized with our place in that history. My students versus the campus policeman who came by and was just loved the exhibition and had a lot of connections to Brio, knew all about it. And then all the students that come in that have never heard of it. But there's just so many different perspectives that have been revolving around both of these projects that have been kind of mind-blowing, which has really been entertaining and fascinating and informative. So it's been great.
Great.
Yeah, I think I've had a similar experience in terms of what I've learned. And for the last several years, one of the theater projects I've been working on has been a sort of site-specific piece in Washington, D.C., where we're activating areas of the city for people using local history. And in D.C., the local history is the national history, right? So there's something already very prominent about that. I think for me, working on this project, what has really lit me up and what I've seen light up in my students is that Houston is not a place that gets written about a lot. And I think that there is something incredibly empowering for my students to know that a play is about their neighborhood, that a play is about their parents, their aunts and uncles. And I teach an introduction to theater class, and I was talking about the play that they'll have to see this semester. And, for the most part, they're just taking their notes. And when I said it's about the Brio Superfund site, one of my students just looks up with the biggest eyes and goes, oh my God, my mom receives a settlement fund for that. She went to college because of the Brio Superfund site. And for me as a theater maker, my takeaway has been because of that what we need to be doing more of, not only just for the sake of making great art, but also art that really speaks to people, especially in the current sort of media environment. We have to be telling our stories, the stories where we are, where our audiences are.
Yeah, I'll say after having written comics, which were almost complete inventions, the characters were completely invented and While all my comics have been based around like the uh, regional Gulf Coast environment, the characters are totally invented. So trying to, and while the characters for Brio are also totally invented, knowing like how close to home that is, trying to like write about something in an even like semi-accurate way was totally terrifying to me. And I know like they're the characters are imperfect. I don't think they're like a true representation necessarily of like people's experiences, but I have had so many, just in the artist community even, so many people come to me and say, "Oh, I grew up right near there. Oh, I remember when that happened." And I think people are, even if it's like an imperfect vision, they're very excited to see themselves like represented in some way. And so that's like motivating to at least give it a shot, even even when it's scary. To you don't want to fail people. So
All right, we're back to recording. Yeah, I'll just cue you with a question, and you can just
sure.
go wild on that. So I'm really interested in the research process for this, because clearly this is a really kind of research-based piece that you're coming up with, and the engagement with Brio in particular. I'm sure certainly beyond talking to community advocates, which you've mentioned, I imagine there's other forms of research you were undertaking. So can you tell us a little about that process, and then anything that you discovered that really resonates or stands out with you?
Sure. So before writing, I spent a lot of time reading the back issues from the early 90s when the South Bend neighborhood, along with, I guess, spearheaded by Marie Flickinger at the
The South Belt Ellington Leader.
South Belt Ellington Leader, the local newspaper there. I was reading those articles, and one of the things that was the most shocking to me in reading those is how the EPA was really not like the hero in this story. They were more the villain in this story, because the neighborhood, the people there really had to fight with the EPA to be heard. The EPA was more than willing and ready to side with the evidence provided by the commercial interest, the refineries, the petrochemical companies who had been working, because I think the Brio refinery site, it changed hands 5-6 times. Monsanto was in possession of that property for the longest time. But it's still remembered as the Brio refinery site because I think that was the last business interest that owned it. But those were the companies providing the EPA with evidence of how things were safe, supposedly there. And for some reason, the EPA was willing to take them at their word. And so the neighborhood was not only sort of retroactively fighting with these commercial interests, but they're also fighting the EPA.
So much of that fight also, which kind of surprised me, where Marie Flickinger really came in as her role, community leader, wasn't so much to like point the finger at these companies for what they had done, because that was obvious. It was the remediation plan for the area, and they actually, their first plan to clean up the area was to burn it all. And they had actually built a smokestack, a tower, and that's where Marie came in to really fight against that and to have them come up with a different plan to address that land. Because if they just burned everything literally across the street from a brand new community college, San Jac was fairly new, that would have just devastated the area even more. So it's not only keeping an eye on what people are doing in the moment, but how they are addressing after it is found out and after it comes to light. It was one of the most terrifying things for me, I think.
Yeah. I think you had mentioned a particular quote that stood out that...
Yeah, it's actually our fabulous sound designer for the show, Robert Leslie Meek, is creating an amazing soundscape that helps take us through the passage of time. And one of the archival recordings we have is someone saying, "Marie, the EPA is not responsible for the local school children," as there was an elementary school in the South Bend subdivision, Weber Elementary. It's very shocking to hear.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the EPA, Yeah, it has a long history that we've discussed at various points, and is complicated because when you are required to first have all of the research undertaken by companies, and when the Superfund definition is, as we've mentioned before, really more tied to entities that are no longer capable of doing their own cleanup, right? The EPA's first priority is get these institutions to do their own cleanup, and when it's changed 5 or 6 times, changed hands 5 or 6 times, when it's corporations that no longer exist, that gets really murky, and that's usually when a Superfund designation can come in, but also hints at that why a Superfund designation should not be taken as the only site of toxicity, but merely one that is most legally and bureaucratically tricky, which is something that we don't often, I think, understand or recognize. And yeah, the complicated ways the EPA has to move through those processes is there's a reason community advocates are frustrated a lot of the time. Well, this has been fascinating. I'm so excited to hear about this work and everything that you're coming up with. I look forward to seeing both the exhibit and the show. If folks want to make it out to the college and see these, if they want to get involved, how should they find out more? How should they get involved? How can they make it out to get there?
They can buy tickets for the play on the college website, the South Theater and Film page. We can send you a link. The show is running from October 24th through November 2nd. Every performance has 2 entry times, so we would love to have anyone interested come out.
Solastalgia is open now. The gallery is open 9 to 5, Monday through Thursday. We also will do appointments on Fridays. And it's open to the public, no admission, free of charge. You can contact me, or we have a South Campus Gallery page on the San Jac website.
Great. Jonelle Walker, Sarah Welch, Bradley Brown, thank you so much for being here and joining us today.
Thanks.
Thank
Thank you
you.
so much for having us.
We're going to jump back to a conversation we had a few weeks ago now with Heather L. Johnson, who is an artist whose work is being featured in a Diverse Works, which is a local museum, exhibit all about environmental justice, both here in Houston, but more globally. And Heather's working specifically on these BRIO sites as well. And so we want to take you to that to walk through how she's interpreting it, as she's also in this collection coming up at San Jacinto College.
I'm a cross-disciplinary visual artist. I work in media ranging from drawing and hand-stitched embroidery to now video installation, which I'm very new at. But I've been working for this exhibition and for 2 others that are running simultaneously on a project called the BRIO Memory Project, which takes its inspiration from the BRIO Superfund site in Southeast Houston. It's a very tragic story that involves a waste dump that's probably second in the nation in terms of intensity and consequence to Love Canal in New York. It's Texas's Love Canal. The BRIO refining site was a recycling location for refinery byproducts and other waste materials that was used by many, many companies over about 3 decades. And when materials couldn't be recycled, they were basically dumped and buried directly into the ground, into unlined earthen pits. Subdivisions, meanwhile, developments were being put up all around it. The site went bankrupt in 1982, but right around 1985, there was a subdivision called South Bend that was built. Middle income, $70,000 homes, which would have been the equivalent of $200,000 maybe in today's cash. Those homes, it was a normal subdivision, very, kind of homogeneous, very similar to other subdivisions around Houston. One of the draws for me was that I spent my adolescent years in a very similar type of environment in the northern part of Houston, where all the houses look the same, and you go and you pick your model home, and everything was very stratified. You had your your patio homes, and then that were in the $50,000 range to all the way up to your $200,000 to $300,000 4-bedroom jobs with swimming pools. And the school bus would make its round all the way around the subdivision. You'd know exactly what income bracket every student was, right? Anyway, this is a very similar kind of place, at least in my imagination, and what I gleaned from others, it very much was that. But people started getting sick, very, very sick. There were kids who played in the Clear Creek adjacent to the subdivision that ran through the Brio Superfund site and down through, ending in the Gulf of Mexico, obviously. You had people swimming in that creek, kids playing in a ball field nearby. It was discovered that both in the ball field and the subdivision there were also dumping sites that were not known about until later. People got sick. The short story, because it's a long one, is that through the activism of women in the neighborhood whose kids were turning up sick, despite the fact that this was a Superfund site, the EPA was not paying attention to the fact that there were illnesses taking place outside of the rim of the border of the site itself. And so these women would collect data, surveying the homes to determine who was sick and who wasn't, and feeding that information to the local newspaper. And together, the newspaper staff and the women of the subdivision actually got action done, and in the end, the subdivision was bulldozed. And now, today, there are these retention ponds. And the retention ponds I think of as being repositories for memory. This action, though it was necessary, ended up displacing, many, many people, thousands if you think about it, 677 homes in an elementary school. And these effects of this are generational. There are people today who have no idea whether their own kids will be born without ovaries. Many birth defects occurred from this. And so my response to that has been to think about those retention ponds as spaces for healing. The retention ponds hold floodwaters and toxins and overflows from, the surrounding neighborhoods. But they also contain the experiences of not only people who lived in this site and around it who were affected by the situation, but also, there is the trauma of the land itself that we don't think of as being alive. So the project tries to address these things. It tries to address the experiences of the people who remember this place, but it also keeps in mind the trauma of the generations of people and of the landscape itself and the flora and fauna that existed before any of this development, before any of this stuff happened. So I make drawings out of trash that I collect from around the retention ponds. I make paper out of that trash. Oh. I embed the paper with seeds. Ashley gave me that idea. Thank you, Ashley. I embed the paper with seeds of native plants and flowers and grasses. And I make drawings that are based on the stories, that are inspired by the stories of those that I collect pertaining to the history of this site. The drawings go back in the landscape to deteriorate and release the seeds, and I document that in video and stills, and that is what is on display at Diverse Works, these videos.
So that's just a short clip from Heather speaking about some of her work in this Diverse Works exhibit alongside two other artists who came on and spoke with us as well. So you can learn more about that exhibit and hear the whole episode in our back catalog on the podcast. So you should check that out. And if you haven't already listened to it, give it a listen because it's really outstanding work happening there. For how to get involved around Houston this week, I'd like to shout out American Youth Works Texas Conservation Corps, who are hosting a Green Wave cleanup event on Friday, October 25th at Freed Art and Nature Park. It's part of their ongoing Green Wave initiative designed to provide the community with opportunities to engage in environmental care and education. The TXCC AmeriCorps crew members will lead the event as part of their professional development. This is a really great chance to participate in habitat restoration, litter removal, and to earn volunteer hours. And it's going to be on Friday, October 25th, so this Friday, from 10 a.m. to noon. And it's at the Freed Art and Nature Park, 2406 Houston Avenue, Houston, Texas. And so you can learn all about it if you go to ayw.givepulse.com. That's ayw.givepulse.com, and you can sign up and learn more there. So I'd encourage folks who are available, go out on Friday and meet other folks who are keen to make our habitat a little bit cleaner and just a little bit better for everybody. Up next time on Gulf Streams, we'll be talking about the state of environmental education. If you have questions or ideas for what you'd like featured on Gulf Streams, please leave a voicemail at 713-348-4081. That's 713-348-4081, or email me at westonT@rice.edu. A quick reminder that you can catch up on all Gulf Streams episodes anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe and make sure you never miss an episode. Gulf Streams is a co-production of KPFT Houston and Rice's Center for Environmental Studies, with support from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and the Rice Sustainability Institute's Eco Studio. Produced by Weston Twardowski. Co-produced by Joseph Campana. Audio engineer Rico Enriquez. Research support provided by Jaden Bray-Boyce, Numan Rinsdorf, and Sophia Soltez. Stay tuned for the R&R Show with Ronnie Renfro and Tom Richards here on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM.